I wish Nikki Freeman loved me more than anyone in the entire world.
Obsession is a recent horror movie about abusive relationships, being dishonest with yourself, being careful what you wish for. I thought it was a really good one. I think it tackled all of its subjects with nuance and complexity, and it was also just really unsettling. Like, it's a movie that really got under my skin. And if you want to see more movies like it, I've got 5 recommendations for you to watch. Okay, so maybe you watched Obsession and thought to yourself, well, that Nikki character was fun and spooky and scary, you know, and well performed, but I kinda wished she was a car. Then Christine is the movie for you.
That's a piece of shit, Arnie.
Well, she could be fixed up. She could.
Yeah, well, she could be really tough.
Christine came out in the early 80s. It is directed by John Carpenter and is about a young guy who is kind of bullied at school. You know, he's kind of presented to us as this underdog character who then sets out to buy his first car in the hopes of increasing his reputation and self-confidence. And he falls in love with this second-hand old-timer that is named Christine.
Ever since he bought that car, he's been obsessed with it.
After getting his new car, it becomes quickly apparent that things are starting to change and that the car is not exactly what it seems. You know, there's moments where it starts to act up as if it has a personality of its own, of her own, I guess. Like as if it's becoming jealous when Arnie, who is the main character, goes on a date with some other girl or hangs out with his friends, or basically whenever he does anything that is not completely focused on the car.
I'm not going in that car again.
Oh, wait a minute. Don't you blame your choking on Christine.
And Arnie himself also finds he is changing because of the car's influence. At first he seems like he's becoming more confident, a little bit more masculine.
Hey man, no glasses. You're looking good.
But gradually this starts to take a more sinister turn as he's also becoming more abusive, and you know, his confidence turns into arrogance and grandiosity until it all eventually escalates into a violent showdown. Like in Obsession, the premise is actually quite simple, except instead of what if your wish came true in a way that you didn't intend, this one asks, what if your car is evil? But as is also the case with Obsession, there are deeper layers, I think, beneath the simple premise that speak to more things like symbolically. In the case of Christine, I think you'll find a movie that's not just a kind of fun, silly killer car movie, but also a somewhat like a surprisingly meaningful reflection on the relation between men and cars and just the general association of masculinity with vehicles, you know, to the point where it almost becomes like a fetishization.
Talking about Christine, man! No shitter ever came between me and Christine.
It also feels like it captures something distinctively American in that sense. You know, here in Europe, guys can obsess over cars as well, but I always feel like in America it's on another level, and this movie captures that really well and in a really entertaining and fun way.
Hey, don't you like this beer? Thought you like beer.
Next up is another movie from the early 80s, Possession.
Do you need more time? What do you need?
Possession is a movie that immediately throws you off the deep end. We just start in the middle of this confrontation between a man and his wife after the wife has decided that she no longer wants to stay in their family situation, and the two basically separate for the time being.
How long is it gonna last?
I don't know.
1 week, 2 weeks?
The man, of course, has trouble accepting this and initially starts by following around, suspecting that his wife is having an affair with someone. But gradually we come to discover that there's something darker and almost supernatural going on that isn't quite what he thought he was going to find. The reason I thought of this movie was because, like Obsession, this one really has a kind of maximalist approach to creating an atmosphere that is just so unsettling and kind of hard to watch. You know, older horror movies tend to have a reputation of being slightly more subdued and slow, but this one is really going on a wholly different level. The actress who plays the wife, you know, kind of like Nikki in Obsession, just does such a wonderful job at creating this powerhouse of a performance that just doesn't hold back on any level. And the result is some of the most unsettling sequences that I've ever seen in a movie like this. What I think is also interesting here is that, like Obsession, Possession doesn't portray either of its main characters as either purely victim or purely perpetrator or abuser. You know, both of them are kind of toxic in their own way, and it's especially in the clash between them that a lot of this additional violence erupts. And this also captures what I think is basically what this movie is about, which is just the sort of all-destructive power of a divorce, basically. And I won't go into spoilers, but there's one heartbreaking scene, especially with the son, because that's the thing that initially keeps them together. They have a son together, and of course both parents want to see him and want to have time with him, and with that then also forces them to kind of make these arrangements with each other and keep seeing each other and keep coming over to each other's house and so on. But the son in this movie is pretty much like the real Nicky in Obsession. You know, he's ultimately the one who ends up suffering the most at the abuse of his parents, and because of the abuse, the indirect abuse of his parents. And so, like Obsession, despite having a kind of maximalist horror going on, it ultimately manages to land on this really tragic note that just makes the whole thing much more emotional and just gives it more emotional gravitas. Moving on to Japan for the movie Audition. This one has been brought up a couple of times in the discussion surrounding Obsession, but I wanted to bring it up again here because I do think it's a relevant one, and one that you might enjoy if you also liked the themes of Obsession. Audition is about a man who's become a widower, and to find a new girlfriend, he asks his producer friend to host a fake audition. You know, he lets all these women come to the studio in the hope of getting some part, but really, you know, secretly, he's just kind of selecting an ideal partner for himself. Or to put it like this, you know, the women all come in thinking they're about to play some kind of part, but really the part is just the ideal description of what the widower is looking for. And during that process, he becomes infatuated by this one girl who's a bit younger and quieter than all the others. And, you know, the two strike up a relationship in which he slowly comes to realize that she too is not what he had imagined, or that she's not the kind of person that he thought she was. It also just really plays with that idea of men, or I guess anyone, you know, projecting your image of who you think someone is, and then coming to find out the reality of it, and the clash between sort of desire and expectation and the reality of who a person is. In this case, you know, the man sees in this young woman someone who is sort of serene and quiet and precious, but in reality, as we slowly come to learn, she actually has a much darker past that resulted in her becoming a much more complicated and darker person. Now, I do have to say that despite this being labeled as a horror movie and also very much becoming a horror movie by the end of it, for the first hour or so, this does not feel like a horror movie at all. It does play it very kind of safe and unassuming for the most part, and it's really only until the man's expectations start to slowly crumble, you know, in the second half of the movie, that also the tone and the atmosphere begin to shift much more radically. So it's just a warning in case you put this on thinking, oh, I'm gonna watch some great horror movie, and then being kind of surprised when it doesn't feel like a horror movie at all. Like, I promise it's coming, and by the end of it, you're gonna find it was worth it.
How long have you been doing this?
Just over a year.
And speaking of horror movies that save all the good parts until the very end, next up is Saint Maud. This is a relatively recent movie. It's from 2019. It's a feature debut, which I thought was really remarkable.
Forgive me my impatience, but I hope you will reveal your plan for me soon. I can't shake the feeling that you must have saved me for something greater than this.
It's about this young woman who becomes obsessed, or is obsessed, by the idea that she is chosen by God, or at least is somehow in close communion with God, which then gives her a kind of hubris, a kind of grandiosity that prompts her to help this dying woman who's much more of like a hedonist and a realist in life. And, you know, she feels like she's entitled to this quest, this grand quest to save this woman's soul. I would just say up front that if you're gonna watch this one, be sure to watch it all the way to the end, because at first it might seem like it's just like a kind of middling character drama that doesn't have much going on in terms of excitement, or, you know, it might not be the thing that you're looking for if you liked a movie like Obsession, which has a much more maximalist approach, you know, throughout the runtime. But I can tell you, if you make it all the way through, your patience will definitely be rewarded. Like, I won't spoil what happens at the end, but it's gonna be worth it, I promise.
He isn't real. You must know that.
And this is not to say that the rest of the movie isn't good. Like, I thought this was a really compelling, like more of a character study that really gets into like the psychology of the main character, who is this nurse who seems to kind of oscillate between either like extremely pious behavior, completely dedicated to God and religion, and on the other hand, you know, in the moments that she wavers, she also becomes a lot more promiscuous, and, you know, she starts going to bars, hooking up with random guys there. Like, you know, it's just a really compelling portrait of the kind of person who needs extreme structure in her life. Otherwise, she'll fall into extreme chaos. And that kind of tension I thought was really interesting and just gave a lot of internal conflict to this movie, where, you know, even if there's nothing going on, you know, within her, you can always tell like there's a kind of like a kind of battle that's raging, like there's a war going on. The movie also hints at some past trauma that kind of prompted this fracture on the inside of her as the reason that she longs for something to hold on to, you know, whatever way possible. But much of the conflict is also prompted by this woman who she meets, who's dying of cancer, and just someone who's very much resisting whatever the main character is trying to do for her, you know, to save her soul, which for the main character then also becomes like a frustration, because she wants to help this person from her own perspective by, you know, making her find Jesus or whatever, and she's just completely resistant to it. And it generates a lot of internal conflict in her, and it all leads to a really surprisingly like brutal and yet satisfying finale. And yeah, it's just definitely worth a watch if you kind of give it your patience at first a little bit. Last up, I have another classic for you. It's one that I rewatched not too long ago, a little bit before Obsession, but it's one of those movies where you kind of forget how good it is until you watch it again. But anyways, it's Rosemary's Baby. For a little bit in Obsession, I was actually thinking, oh wow, this is kind of like Rosemary's Baby. You know, at first in the scene between Nicky and Bear in the car when he's just made a wish, and it's just still like a very much a personal, like psychological drama where you're not sure like what's going on exactly, and there's like a tension, but not necessarily one that's based on horror or violence or monsters or whatever. And I thought like, oh, it's cool. It's kind of like Rosemary's Baby, you know, it's much more of a classic, slow building, psychological horror. But of course, Obsession then at some point quickly becomes more of a horror movie in the modern sense. So there's a lot more gore, a lot more shocking stuff. And Rosemary's Baby is not like that at all, but I still think it's an interesting watch in combination with Obsession.
We just want to take you home. No one's going to hurt you. For the baby. Put your shoes on.
If you haven't seen it, Rosemary's Baby is about a pregnant woman who begins to suspect that her neighbors are up to something sinister, or that they have like sinister plans for her baby and for her pregnancy. Like they're recommending her all kinds of weird stuff, and they're recommending her a specific doctor for some of her issues. And at one point her boyfriend or husband even becomes like part of the thing that's kind of unsettling her.
Maybe all this is coincidence, but one thing is for sure. They have a coven and they want my baby.
Certainly seems that way.
And again, while this is like the more classical horror movies that are much more slower and that don't have much like going on in terms of like shocking moments or jump scares or anything like it, I think this movie is still such an excellent case study of how to create a consistent atmosphere of being unsettled, basically a consistent atmosphere of like distrust and paranoia, because throughout this thing we are very much locked into Rosemary's perspective, which also means that we sort of share her emotions of paranoia and feeling like she's just being gaslit by everyone around her in a way that's just so distressing, and that I think also speaks very much to the way that women, and especially maybe pregnant women, can feel like the rest of the world wants to dictate what's best for her, even though, you know, she might disagree or whatever. In some way, I would even somewhat carefully argue that this is the movie that Obsession would have been if Nikki had been the protagonist. You know, this is a movie that feels like it's about the feeling of your autonomies and your agency slowly being taken away from you, to the point where you start to question your own sanity even. And so in some ways it's more tragic than scary, but it's also really scary, or at least, you know, it's genuinely unsettling to be in the mindset that she experiences throughout this movie. But again, it's also a horror classic that I think everyone who's even remotely interested in horror movies should have seen at least once. I think, without spoiling the ending, I think this movie is also a great example of the argument for showing less rather than showing more. You know, there's definitely a few moments in this where the movie could have been more explicit or could have shown you something to generate more of a shock, but instead it doesn't, and in some ways it's just all the more effective for it. And yeah, it's just such a classic, and I think one that's especially interesting through that lens of like autonomy and agency and so on, and as a study on suspense and filmmaking in general. And so yeah, these are my 5 recommendations based on Obsession. I really enjoyed seeing all of you respond to the previous video on Project Hail Mary with your own recommendations. I thought that was a lot of fun. And also let me know what other movie you want recommendations for. And yeah, that's all I got for today. Thank you for watching. This was Tom from the main channel, Like Stories of Old. Thank you for joining me on this second channel, and I'll see you in the next one.